Welcome to this session where we are going to be talking about how we are going to be addressing the issue around Scope 3 emissions. Now, I think as we think about Scope 3 emissions, the first thing that is important to recognize is that the more you know about this, the more you realize that you don't know a lot. It is complicated because everyone's Scope 3 is somebody else's Scope 1. So as you get into the weeds around carbon accounting, you begin to realize that actually the levers for addressing Scope 3 are very, very different from the levers that you have to address Scope 1 decarbonisation. Why? Because while everyone can recognize the importance of addressing supply chain decarbonisation, there are a lot more in control around your own Scope 1 emissions as compared to the emissions of your entire supply chain. The other complexity really is the fact that the suppliers within your supply chain are at very different levels of capability. Some of the suppliers might be small and medium-sized enterprises in developing countries or developing economies where the capacity to be able to undertake decarbonization is a lot more limited. On the other hand, other parts of your value chain might be with larger, more sophisticated companies in developed markets where the capacity to be able to do something about their emissions, in fact, the regulations that they might be subject to, will be a lot more robust. So within this inherent complexity, tells us that when it comes to addressing Scope 3 versus Scope 1 emissions, there needs to be much greater flexibility in the way that we can approach it. So one way, I think, is to be able to have a clear guidance kind of a document that actually spells out what the issues are and to be able to explain a little bit around the range of legitimate options that one can have to actually address Scope 3 emissions, which is why I'm delighted to be able to come on this stage and share that with Mark from VCMI, who will be explaining to us a little bit around their Scope 3 guidance. Mark?
Thanks, Fred. Thank you very much, Fred, for that very kind introduction. So, as Fred has said, I'm Mark Kenber, the Executive Director of the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, and we've been working to develop and provide guidance for companies on how they can use carbon credits and other market-based mechanisms as part of their corporate decarbonisation journeys. Now, as Fred said, and you all know, Scope 3 is important and it's complicated. It's important because it requires companies, particularly the largest companies in the world, to think not only about what they produce and how they produce it, but where they source their materials from, and equally importantly, about the products themselves, because Scope 3 requires downstream as well. How I use your products, how I dispose of them, and all of those mean that companies have to think beyond just the narrow confines of their own institutions. We also know that Scope 3 emissions are, as Fred has said, difficult, but like all emissions, reducing them can be costly, especially we know that the last 10 or 20% of emissions reductions required cost more than the first 80%. And often, it's not just cost, technologies, techniques are not available. At the moment, companies who have voluntary or semi-voluntary targets, if they don't hit those targets, can shrug their shoulders and go, I tried. And I think the planet and the climate, and we all know that's not good enough. So we've provided guidance, VCMI, on both how companies should and can use market-based mechanisms, not only to bridge the gap, but to show progress year after year after year. And it's also important to think that this Scope 3 gap is significant. If we just take the companies in the world, 12,000 or so of them, that have net zero commitments, the gap between where they are and where they should be with their Scope 3 emissions by 2030 will be twice the total emissions of Europe. Twice the total emissions of Europe, the gap between just 10 to 12,000 companies are and where they should be on their Scope 3 emissions. That's clearly not good enough. So, along with all our guidance, we've provided tools for how companies can use carbon credits credibly and follow the mitigation hierarchy. VCMI's claims code requires companies to follow 4 basic steps. 1, demonstrate that you are being a good corporate citizen on climate change. You have a public inventory, you're committed to net zero, you've set meaningful science-aligned net zero targets, and you haven't just set them, but you're putting money where your mouth is and governance where your mouth is. Then, having set your targets, you need to show progress towards them. It's no good saying, in 2050 we're going to get there. You need to show that by 2025, by 2030, you are making real progress. And then you're using carbon credits to supplement or complement that rather than to substitute. Then you should use high quality carbon credits. That's step 3. And we recommend credits that meet the ICVCM's core carbon principles. And finally, highly important, transparency. We all know that people are, I guess, sometimes skeptical about what companies are doing. And the best way to overcome that skepticism is to say, I've reduced my emissions like this much, I've used this many credits, I've reported them separately and transparently, and this is how I'm using them. And that's what our Scope 3 Action Code of Practice does. It provides a clear, science-aligned, high-integrity way for companies to take responsibility for their emissions when they cannot meet them through decarbonisation alone. Now, we've set a limit of 25%, and this was that's 25% of the total target that companies can meet with carbon credits. And we did that by analysing all the companies that have science-based targets, and we found that 90% of them would never be more than 25% off track and should be back on track by 2040. But we recognise that those are the self-ordained, high-achieving, high-ambition companies. We also need to think about the next 40,000 listed companies in the world that aren't there. So it may be appropriate for some sectors and in some regions, in some countries, to think about a different percentage. 25% is a one-size-fits-all, and as we all know, one size never fits all. So we invite companies and governments to think about how they should change the parameters while maintaining the integrity and the 4-step process. So with that, let me invite Fred back on stage. Happy to answer any questions that any of you may have.
Yeah. Actually, Mark, I have a question.
Perfect.
So when you think about the use of carbon credits in order to address Scope 3 emissions, could you perhaps share with the audience a little bit around how you look at the hierarchy of how one should go about decarbonizing and what kind of carbon credits are actually acceptable? So beyond the CCP labels, would say removal and reduction credits both be equally acceptable?
Okay, so in terms of the first point, the mitigation hierarchy, it's very clear that you need to avoid emissions first, then reduce emissions, and then use market-based mechanisms when you can't go beyond that. Now, that's clear when I say it. As soon as you get to become a company, then deciding what you can do and what you can't do and when you shouldn't is much harder. But I think the way we've laid this out shows that companies have to make real efforts, and then other guidance, whether it's from SBTi or other organizations, shows, okay, you can have an approach that engages with your suppliers. You could work with other customers to have a joint investment or joint purchasing procurement agreement with suppliers to help them reduce their emissions. You can also think about your products. When it comes to the credits themselves, we say yes to the CCP labeled units, and we would make no distinction between nature or technology, removals or reductions, and we wouldn't expect companies, if they're using them for voluntary purposes, to require a corresponding adjustment either. They are making a contribution to helping another country reach their targets, and that is, to my mind, not only acceptable but laudable.
Right. You know, one of the things that we are constantly grappling with is the complexity of measuring Scope 3, the complexity of different parts of the value chain, that there are like different kinds of companies, different stages of growth, different capacities, different countries and jurisdictions in which they are subject to. So how does this guide really account for the fact that your Scope 3 is really going to be quite complicated and really covering all manner of companies and suppliers within and users within the supply chain?
Well, I mean, in a way, Fred, that was the point I made at the end of my initial intervention, that we may need to vary this by sector and by country. There will be some countries or some sectors where Scope 3 emissions are much harder to reduce. For example, we know that in the financial sector, Scope 3 emissions can be 98 or 99%
Absolutely.
of total emissions. In the cement sector, maybe just 15 or 16%. So there's a huge variety from sector to sector, from region to region. And so we've set out this framework as a starting point.
Right.
Something that shows you can use carbon credits with integrity as part of a corporate climate
So
transition.
the 25% is more a guide, and then to cater to the specific situation, you can toggle up and down. But I guess the idea is it's not zero, but it won't be 100.
Exactly.
Right. Are there any questions from the audience for Mark or for myself around the application of carbon credits and how we go about addressing Scope 3 emissions?
No, stunned silence.
If not, maybe I'll just follow up with one other question. You were talking about the need to also have a plan, a science-aligned plan for decarbonization. In your experience working with many companies, take away all the more sophisticated, larger MNCs that obviously have the capability to do that. But for smaller companies, how would you go about recommending for them to have develop and execute a science-aligned plan?
So I would start thinking about a plan rather than specific targets, and I would think about your Scope 1 emissions.
Okay.
First of all, we designed this Scope 3 for those companies that, there are 50,000 large listed companies in the world, and they all ought to be thinking about Scope 1, 2, and 3. But we know that very few are. So start with Scope 1, because that is important. That's understanding your own emissions. Just by understanding them, many companies have found that just by measuring and understanding the opportunities to reduce in a way that is beneficial in terms of productivity and efficiency and supplier and customer engagement come as they would. And I would then argue for the next company, those next range of companies, they should be thinking about a plan that includes their own decarbonisation, engagement with suppliers and customers, and use of carbon credits, and report those transparently. Don't pretend they're the same thing. Report them transparently, but it's all about global mitigation.
Now, we have spoken a little bit around what you can do to address the emissions. But before you can actually take steps to address the emissions, you've got to know what kind of emissions you're actually dealing with. So for the larger companies, they obviously have the resources to hire the best accountants and people who can actually, study to the nth degree and calculate what their Scope 3 emissions are. In your experience looking at companies globally, how do smaller companies actually address that problem of being able to have some robustness in a way that they can calculate and measure and define their Scope 3 emissions?
Well, I think to start with, without making perfect precision the enemy of good enough precision, for most companies, the emissions are going to come from electricity use, that's Scope 2, heating, cooling, and transport. And most of those are fairly straightforward to estimate, if not always measure. And so you can probably get 70-80% of your footprint sorted out just by those 3 or 4 things. And after all, those are the things that we need to do globally. Reduce the fossil intensity of heat, of electricity, of transport, and then land use. And if you look at those first 3, which is what will cover most companies, make a start.
So make a start, essentially. Yeah. Okay, great. At this point in time, I will check again and see if there are any questions from the floor. Anyone who have questions around how corporates should actually go about their decarbonization journey? No. Then maybe
I want to ask you something, Fred. When you're looking at,
I was trying to be proactive in asking more questions, right?
So I'm not going to let you off the hook. So when you think about companies here in Singapore, including the companies that you work with, do they think more about here is a target, one after another, or are they thinking, what does my transition look like in a way that contributes not only to my growth, green growth, but also to global mitigation? And I ask that because obviously a lot of the time you get fixated on an individual company's targets, whereas I think with this framework and the work a lot of the work you've been doing, we're thinking about global mitigation. So if we can have more mitigation at a country level because a company has contributed, that's a good thing rather than a bad thing.
Indeed so. I think that as an investor and shareholder, I think we have to tailor our messages in a way that is pragmatic and practical for the companies that we are engaging with. And oftentimes, the way that I go about it is to explain that you need both a vector and a coordinate. So in other words, you need to have a sense of the general direction in which you're going, which is the vector, but you also need to have some intermediate waypoints, which are the coordinates. And it is important to be able to pin down what some of these intermediate targets or waypoints actually are, because otherwise, in the near term, it is impossible for us, being on the board or as shareholders, to be able to pin down and understand is progress actually being made.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it is not overly practical, I would imagine, to go into very high-level discussions with companies, especially if they are smaller, younger, right, newer. They are fighting fires all the time on how to grow the business. So they may not have a lot of time nor bandwidth and capacity to engage us on esoteric conversations around supply chain decarbonisation. But what would be very practical is to say, look, you have got to be able to identify some targets for decarb for yourself, because you might be under regulatory pressure to do so. You might be under customer pressure, customer expectations to do so, and then having some very concrete near-term steps. And of course, as you know, shareholders and being on the board, it is also important to understand that some things are within their control and some things are not. So I would be a lot tougher with a company around their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions than I would be around their Scope 3. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what you say about, as an investor, wanting to understand and needing to have clarity about what's acceptable and what isn't, plays right into the Scope 3 guide. So you as an investor can say, okay, the company has said we're following this. That's been developed by a science-based multi-stakeholder process. It's been validated, it's been road tested, it's good enough. So it's a useful thing for an investor as well.
And part of the narrative I think that we need to have with our companies is increasingly shifting it from just you got to do good by decarbonizing to there is a possibility of actually having value engineering, being able to be more cost efficient and effective if you are able to use less energy, use less water, produce less waste. So it is a conversation around value and not values. So it is a totally legitimate, rational conversation that you can have with companies and other shareholders. And that is the reason why I think that going down that narrative around this is a way to help you manage your business better, future-proofing your business better, being a lot more climate resilient in a world where things are changing. That is the kind of conversation I think we want to have with our companies.
Absolutely. We've got a few minutes, questions? Yeah, gentleman here, the lady there. You have to go to the standing mic. More pressure.
Sorry, Adam.
That's okay, Fred. As you rightly said, one large company's Scope 3 is someone else's Scope 1, which is sort of talking about. What practically are the moonshots to get more smaller companies focusing on their Scope 1s? Yes, they don't have the expertise, the time, the experience, all those things. But if we have a better system so they're focusing on that, is it through interactions with Zero and sort of upstreaming it in that kind of way through their accounting systems? What do you think's the silver bullet to help them?
I think carbon accounting as a service is going to be increasingly commoditized and it's going to be increasingly less expensive. So if we are able to kind of like simplify it without making it simplistic, right? Then that way we actually drive down the cost of compliance or even measurements and accounting for even smaller companies. You take the ISO standards. You can be talking about food prep, right, and food hygiene. But if you are a big, sophisticated company, the standards are a lot more rigorous, though they are checking off against similar categories. Whereas if you are a small company, maybe it would be not any less robust, but they will be checking for fewer things for you to be able to comply with a particular standard, recognizing that your capacity to comply is a little bit different. So the key thing is we got to simplify and templatize this to make it easier for anyone to be able to account for their emissions. 2, we got to drive down costs so that the compliance cost of doing this is actually lower. And 3, we got to simplify the rules of what it means after you know. Because once you see the numbers, you cannot unsee it. And then the question is, if you know the numbers, then what are you going to do about it? And that is what I think Mark and the team is actually advocating for here. Inga?
Hello, yeah. I'm involved in financial services boards in the US. And the relief around the table when all the SEC required disclosures fell away and everything was huge. Now, they do understand the science, but I have to say I'm usually labelled as the green European when I try to challenge a bit on that. Any tips? Because I know, Fred, you said it's all about telling them that it's going to create value in the long term, but I still feel it's a bit of an uphill battle.
Indeed so. And I think that there could possibly, Inga, be a bit of a threshold. If it costs very little, and it is also part of an information system internally for a company to be able to track its operational metrics well, then I think the level of resistance will be a lot less. The difficulty of us in creating a narrative around this is that it's always about like creating costs. is additional costs, is additional compliance requirements, it is regulatory disclosure, it is about environmental groups trying to pressure a company on how they're acting. But if we shift the narrative and say, look, does anybody actually question you when you say that I need to have a management system that actually creates a good performance operational dashboard on like how many widgets I produce a day, how productive my factories are, what my financials are at any given point in time? Nobody questions the need to have competent and capable information systems to give you that kind of information. Now, to the extent that we can link some of these environmental data to creating shareholder value and in fact operational value for the companies, then I think the level of resistance will go down. I think it's also incumbent of us to be able to make that point and make that point clearly and convincingly.
Great, and as we're just, I think we're now to wrap up.
Yes.
I'll make 2 or 3 final points. One, I think what we're saying, one message, macro message we're saying here is not all companies can decarbonize at the same pace. We've heard that there are difficulties with decarbonizing Scope 3. It is not acceptable in a world that is burning to say, I can't decarbonize, so I'll do nothing. This provides a framework to use carbon credits with integrity as part of that decarbonization journey. It therefore means also, number 2, we can say to companies, yes, we accept the fact that the technology may not be available right now, or that it may be too expensive right now, but you have no excuse not to act right now, because here is a framework which allows you to contribute to mitigation elsewhere. And not to do so should be as unacceptable as not reducing emissions that you can reduce yourself. So with that, thanks, Fred.
Thanks, Mark. All right, thank you, everybody.